Ideas define who we are.
Ideas sustain and protect us.
They inspire.
And challenge us.
Ideas compel us to take moral action.
For generations, the Bet Midrash is where Jewish ideas have been generated, debated, and refined.
With more than 100 faculty and fellows,
and reaching thousands of Jewish learners
and leaders,
Jewish ideas are not just intellectual.
They spark audacious action. The Hartman Institute is reimagining the Jewish people, the State of Israel, and Judaism itself as they should be.
Religiously and politically pluralistic.
Courageous.
Passionate.
Hartman empowers Jewish leaders and strengthens our communities.
Our ideas shape an agenda for Jewish life in North America and Israel.
We hope you'll join us in boldly imagining what comes next for the Jewish people.
Welcome to the conversation.
Power. Is it an instrument or is it a value? I want to suggest that one of the answers to why Israel is that Israel gives the Jewish people the gift of power as not an instrument, but as a value. If Yehuda introduced the notion of an idea, and his talk was about the idea of the idea, my talk will be about the idea of power. And remember, idea is an aspiration, but it is also a framework through which to think about your world. The idea is the principal storyline within your narrative. And I want to look at the way power has shaped the story of Israel. And like any story, especially one which by definition is aspirational, some of it will be inspirational and some of it will be aspirational. See, sovereignty at its core is only possible with power. Sovereignty literally means to hold territory to the exclusion of all others, and you're able to exclude all others only to the extent that you have, either directly or indirectly, access to power. And for that matter, hard power, as distinct from, and this is a category we'll be talking more about, soft power. You have to be able to protect your borders. You have to be able to protect your citizens. You have to be able to look after your own welfare. That is what it means to be sovereign. Sovereignty assumes power, but even more than that, sovereignty assumes the legitimacy of using power. If you don't assume that legitimacy, you have to get out of the sovereign business. And so this idea of power is what I want to spend all of our time on. And I want to tell you, I've been spending years on it, thinking about it, struggling with it. And if you want to understand Israeli society, we are both in love with power, and some of us are embarrassed by the way we use it. But it's within that story of power that Zionism, the Israel story, I want to suggest, that is a lens, that is an idea with which to unpack everything that's going on here, for the good and for the bad. Let's just spend a few minutes looking at, in very gross terms, the story of Israel through the lens of power. Early Zionism was only about soft power. We couldn't even imagine having hard power. We needed Britain, we needed the United Nations or the League of Nations to affirm our right. And power essentially meant, for the early Zionists, the power to reclaim a dimension of life that we had lost in diaspora existence. And that dimension of life was a connection to land and a connection to your body. We were going to have the power to be able to transcend and take our whole existence out of the book and put it into the real world. And we yearned to be more full human beings through that exercise of power. As Berdychevsky beautifully says, I recall the teaching of the sages. There's this great teaching which says, Hamahalech baderech, whoever walks by the way and interrupts his study to remark, how fine is that tree? Hamahalech baderech umafsik mimishnato v'omer ma yafeh ilan zo. You're walking along the way, and obviously what do you do when you walk along the way? You study Torah. Because Torah you're supposed to study how long? All the time. Vagita bo yamam v'layla. So walking is just another opportunity to engage in Torah. And if in the midst of your conversation you're awed by a tree and you stop your learning and you say, Ma yafeh ilan zo, how beautiful is this tree, the rabbis say, mitchayev b'nafsho. He has forfeited his life. And it is a he, because only he speak about in Torah. But Berdychevsky says, but I assert that then alone will Judah and Israel be saved when another teaching is given unto us, namely, whoever walks by the way and sees a fine tree and a fine field and a fine sky and leaves them to think on other thoughts, that man is like one who forfeits his life. Give us back our fine trees and fine fields. Give us back the universe, and you could extend, give us back our bodies. I don't want to just be part of a tradition which sees the essence of Jewish life as the study of Torah. There's something perverse about that being. And the power of Zionism was to reclaim the totality of life. That's what it meant to be powerful. Now, if we did that, we would be defeating and overcoming anti-Semitism and the dangers that Jews faced. Israel enabled Jews to be safe if Israel would make us normal people so that there would be no reason to hate us anymore. Because we're normal. We would either not be hated because we would be taken out of your space, and we wouldn't be sitting like a parasite on your national existence, or we would be people that everybody in the world says, yeah, this is a normal people. And so the first stage of power was through channeling the soft power that we had to create safety through normalcy. Now open up a little footnote, and we'll be opening up lots of little footnotes. This notion of the land, far more than the sanctity of the land of Israel, is what created the initial conflict with the indigenous Palestinian population. We wanted land. As we saw, we wanted our kibbutzim. We didn't want, if we just wanted to live in Tel Aviv, we would have had peace a long time ago. It would have been a small piece, but we would have had peace a long time ago. It would have been a pishy little piece, but it was fine. Tel Aviv wasn't competing with the indigenous population. We wanted to own land, not just defensible borders. That too, but initially we came here and there were so few of us. My family, we moved, as many of you know, we moved to Israel in the 17th century. Literally. We moved to Israel in the 17th century. My aunt's great ancestor was one of the first chief rabbis of Jerusalem. That didn't mean much. There were only 3 Jews here. Let's just get real. It was sort of, it would like to be the chief rabbi of Jerusalem was sort of like being a gabbai. You were the ones who schlepped around saying what, but he was. And they stayed here for he's actually buried near the Rambam in Tveria. And then they left about 100 years later, and we came back in 1830. And since 1830, we're living in Jerusalem. My grandchildren study 20 yards from where their great-great-grandfather was born, which is interesting in the old city. So some old-timers, they lived in Jerusalem. They were poor, they were primitive. We'll talk about their notion of power soon. But the Zionists, they didn't want to live in Jerusalem. They wanted industry. They wanted land. They wanted the normalcy that land, the type of human being that it created. And it is precisely because of that, and precisely because we did not come to a land without a people, that there began to be conflict. Pre-state, 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Power essentially meant, before the state, to try to defend Jews, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. And I'm emphasizing the word to try. And then post-48, power meant the ability to sustain sovereignty. This power was tenuous. It was very often assumed to be miraculous, and please remember that because that's going to be very important. Because when power is miraculous, someone else is getting involved. And we're going to have to talk about what happens when somebody else gets involved. We squeaked through. We were sovereignish. It was dangerous. Our existence was precarious, but when you compared it to Auschwitz, it was the Garden of Eden. When you compared it to Tsar Russia, when power was determined by whether you could outrun a Cossack, this was unbelievable. But objectively, it was very, very, very limited. Everything changes in 1967. 1967 is when power gives us absolute and total and unambiguous victory. 1967 is when the War of Independence comes to an end. Now we won. Our power dwarfed that of all those around us. We, with that power, began to think in terms of invincibility. And most significantly, power began to intoxicate. And with that intoxication came tremendous excitement, pride. This was not a little power, this was a victory worthy of all victories. And hard power began to be embraced as a result of Israel by Jews worldwide as a new and essential feature, not of Israel and not of Zionism, but of Judaism. To be a Jew was now to be a being of power. But the experience of 1967, at least for Israelis, didn't last that long. The 70s began a period of schizophrenia. On the one hand, the 1973 war, and on the other hand, symbolized by Entebbe. Entebbe. And it wasn't just Entebbe, it could be Sabina, it could be whatever it was. On the one hand, we were still the 1967 Jews who can fly half across the earth and outsmart and outmanipulate and defeat, completely defeat our enemy. Now, in military terms, the greatest military victory in the history of the State of Israel was the 1973 war. In pure military terms, it was an unequivocal victory. We reached Damascus and we could have reached Cairo. And the starting position was far worse, objectively, than the worrying that we had pre-67. We didn't know pre-67 that somebody was actually planning. They didn't just wake up and say, oh, I have an idea. They actually planned it. The opening start of the 73 war, as a result of being intoxicated by power, was probably even worse than we experienced in 1947 and 48. And to be able to turn that around was a sign of the immense power that we now had. But it didn't feel that way. For Israelis, it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like a bigger 67. It started to feel closer to 48. We won, but what we really won was the ability to maintain our sovereignty. And even though we got to Damascus or could go as far as we want, we knew that that was untenable. It was about surviving in the Middle East and also recognizing this is something that has still deep in our consciousness, how precarious our sovereignty is. And never forget it. And so 67 changed the story, but only partially. It's a schizophrenia, we're like split. There's a 67 dimension and there's a 73 dimension, which is connected to the 48 dimension. 1980s and 90s are defined by the Lebanon War and the Intifadas. Pre-1967, Israel would not have embarked on a war in Lebanon. The war in Lebanon was a direct result of an assumption of the limitlessness of our power. We can actually set up a new order in Lebanon. And now here, I want you to remember this as well for later. The war in Lebanon was half a war of self-defense and half a war of aggression couched in self-defense terms. And the more powerful you are, the more you expand the parameters of what constitutes self-defense. Listen, they're endangering us on a regular basis. It would be in our defense interest to have a new regime in Lebanon. Does that count as self-defense? If you are powerful enough, Russia, without comparing, also calls Ukraine a war of self-defense. America could go to a war of self-defense 10,000 miles from its borders. Superpowers, what they do, no superpower ever engages in a war of aggression. They don't. Because my interests are so expansive, having to defend them is always an act of self-defense. And Lebanon was a taste of that type of thinking. Lebanon, and then after the Intifada, dramatically change our attitude towards power, or our understanding of it. And I want you to just digest this for a second. Israel has not won a single war since 1973. The fundamental experience of the Intifada is that we have enough power to sustain our sovereignty. We do not have enough power to completely insulate or protect our citizens. Life in Israel, post-Lebanon, is dangerous. Life in Israel from the first Intifada on, and that was not life post-67. I made Aliyah in 71. We would just walk in Beit Lechem. We were the masters of the universe, and remember that term. We were the masters of the universe. We walked anywhere, went anywhere. I didn't have to carry a gun, even think about having a gun. Since the second Intifada, we are powerful enough to protect this country. We are not powerful enough to defeat the dangers that we face. And this is really important because psychologically, Israelis are back in a 1948 modality with the power of a post-67 people. Which means, if you look at the 21st century, Second War in Lebanon, Second Intifada, Gaza 1, Gaza 2, Gaza 3, Gaza 4, and everything in between. Everything is an asymmetrical war, which is a direct consequence of a realignment of our power into a position of being a superpower in our area. Objectively, our power is immense. But the one thing we can't do is protect our kids. What more do you want? Can't protect them. We can't win. Victory is when the other side agrees to a ceasefire. The whole notion of completing, finishing, defeating is off the table. Since the 80s. Interestingly, there is a new dimension of soft power being associated with Israel. Startup nation entails and assumes a tremendous amount of power. And now our ability to protect our interests does not merely require hard power, but we could develop relationships with countries on the basis of their interest to trade with us. The Gulf states, the Abraham Accords is an accord of is a victory of soft power, not of hard power. It's an absolute victory. of Israel's capability, what we cannot achieve in the domain of our hard power, which is right around us, we're able to, in Gaza and Judea and Samaria, we're able to achieve further away through the utilization of soft power and people's mutual interests to want to trade with us for our financial, because of our financial and intellectual capabilities. So every idea, I could tell you this history of Israel through multiple ideas. Power is one essential part of our story. Right up till now, I was just merely describing how the experience of power, which is so intimately connected to the Jewish people's embracing of sovereignty or achieving sovereignty, has shifted and moved in the last 74 and a half years. But now, I want to shift to not merely describing this story, but analyzing and attempting to prescribe a vision of power. What is the story not of Israel's power alone, but what is our Jewish story of Israel's power? My own personal life spans 67 till today. I personally experienced the remarkable transformation of Jewish power. And at the same time, not only am I a 60s child, I'm also a 70s, 80s, 90s, and most importantly, I am a parent in the 21st century. And now I know and experience daily my inability to keep my children safe. The inability of the state of Israel to keep our children safe. One of my closest friends, Gil Troy, it's very funny. You have friends at different times. Like normally what you do is your really close friends are the ones who your children grow up with. And so you go through experiences at the same time. He is my age, but he has children, 2 stages. He has children in the army now. To run with Gil Troy on Friday morning is to run with somebody who has to constantly live with the experience of having a child in Duvdevan. And in case you don't know what Duvdevan is, a version of Fauda. And we know we could keep Israel alive. Leaving Iran aside, it's a little footnote. Well, leaving Iran aside for a moment, we're very safe and secure. But Israel's not a safe place, as you know. How many people, now this week was not so bad, last week, a month ago, if you came to Israel, people would ask you, is it safe? You're more worried about sending your children to a gap year in Israel than sending them to college on campus with all the increased anti-Semitism. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. So if power essentially cannot save the Jews, if power can't protect the Jews, or hard power can, in what way is it of value? Power is not of value because it could protect you. Power is of value because it gives you the ability to take responsibility for your destiny. The idea of power is to enable us to be players and to shape our own destiny. And it could be that power actually endangers us. It could be that right at this moment, using soft power might be far more safe for the Jews than hard power. Soft power in America, maybe even soft power, I saw an article in Hungary, of all places, might be safer than this hard power experiment of Israel. But we embrace this not because it will protect our children. We embrace it because we believe this is what it means to be a full human being. That as a human being, I want to stand up and do everything that I can to shape my life and to shape my future. And I prefer the dangers of power than the safety of powerlessness. Because in this story, what it means to be a human being is to be somebody who has access to power. And that the fullness of what it means to be a human being is to be able to influence or try to influence your destiny. This is what God creates us as in Genesis chapter 1. And God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth." And God created human beings in God's image. In the image of God created them, male and female. God created them, and God blessed them and said, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it." To be created in the image of God, according to Genesis, not to be able to contemplate the divine truths, as Maimonides claims. It's not our intellectual capacity. Give me back my body. And Genesis 1 says, yes, to be created in the image of God is not your intellectual capacity. It is the ability to rule the world and master it. That is why you were created. You, human beings, were created to be the demigods of history. God chose you either as God's partner or as God's replacement to rule the world and master it. That's why we are here. That's what distinguishes the human being from every other creature created. Our job is to rule and master, is to marshal power. And Zionism is about the Jewish people's decision to reclaim that part of our humanity that was absent for 2,000 years in exile. I don't want the power of the book of Esther. Great story, happy ending. Just prostitute your niece. Little detail. We won. We couldn't lift up a finger. We needed permission every time to fight. Zionism is about creating or reclaiming for the Jews, not our ability to manipulate political influence, but our ability to wield power. To be again Jews of muscle. And some of you are new, some of you know me. I have stories. You know, all of our lives are stories. My deepest love, my deepest connection to this country is to be able to have the honor to participate in protecting myself and my people. It's the deepest honor of my life. Not this, not Hartman Institute. The deepest honor of my life is to be one of the few Jews in history who can now protect themselves. And I remember the feeling of it as a 13-year-old. In the early 70s, everybody would call us, oh, ata chayal, the chayal. I was 13. I was 4 feet 10. Literally 45 pounds. Post bar mitzvah. 90-pound weakling was an aspiration. I was a 45-pound weakling was literally more. Literally, it's like, it was just funny. And I remember when I finally became a soldier, people didn't know whether to laugh or cry when they saw me. It literally was that pathetic. I had grown 12 inches, I was close to 6 feet, and I weighed about 103 pounds. Literally. Now, thank God I was in a religious unit. No, there's a reason. It's not a joke, this is for real. Because stretcher hikes, who do they want to put on a stretcher? But in non-Hesder units, the person who was on the stretcher was put there and hit all the time. It was like they would judge you with, Hesder boys were sweet, yeshiva boys, like you don't hurt people. So a big part of my army was quite sweet, I saw Sinai like this. It was like, it was like I had, what it's like on half of basic training to make sure you don't fall asleep, because the definition of political incorrectness is to fall asleep when you're on the stretcher. You don't do that. There has to be some level of empathy to the people who are carrying it. And as you know, in the Army's infinite wisdom, and this is part of what we learned because the Army has a deep analysis of every soldier's remarkable capabilities and how they could help this larger vision of maintaining Israel's sovereignty to the best of their personal ability. A 19-year-old decided that my first job in the Army before becoming a tank commander was to be a loader. Donniel Hartman, all 105 pounds of him, was going to load 60-pound shells. And that was Donniel, this is why we needed you. This is your unique role in Jewish history. And as many of you know, you could have the best tank commander in the world. You could have the best tank in the world, which we didn't. You could have the best gunners in the world, everything. If there isn't a shell in the tank, in the gun, this is not what we call in Israel good for the Jews. And there was no way. It was just not happening. It was just not going to be. I tried. I was a really good soldier. I was really committed. But God gave me what God gave me, or rather, God didn't give me what God didn't give me, and it just wasn't going to happen. And I remember, and to this day, my deepest Zionist experiences to this very day was in the sands of the Sinai Desert, when everybody else was resting, and my tank commander said to me, Dani, in Hebrew they call me Dani, Dani Boena. And while everybody rested, it didn't matter in the middle of the heat or in the freezing in the nighttime, he didn't sleep either, because he knew that he would die if I wasn't going to get a shell in the gun. And we trained, and we trained, and we trained, and we trained. It was impossible. It was miserable. It was painful, and it was exhilarating. Because I knew that if I trained, my people lived. To feel that, not safety, but to feel it. And I didn't develop muscles, but I developed a system of using my hip and leverage. Using my hip and leverage Some of you who carry little children will know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't have to use your arms if you have other parts of your body. I found a way, and because the shells weren't thick, you would pull, hip, poof. I got really, really good. Really, really good. I was actually voted outstanding soldier of that stage of training. It was not because I was a great soldier, because I made more progress than anybody else, but that wasn't a big, but that, to be able to do that, that's the gift of Israel. I'm a human being, not a fly. I'm not a leaf. I'm a human being. And I stand. And I might not be able to win, but I'm going to be a player, not a spectator, in the story that my people are going to tell. And I want to tell you, Dayenu. I feel a Dayenu. Pre-67, in our story, this Dayenu was unmitigated. Because we couldn't even imagine that we would use our power unjustly. When you come, and you saw this in the movie when you come out of Auschwitz, all you can think about is that your power is in defense. That's all you can imagine. You don't even imagine that you could have power to harm. The essence of your power is self-defense. That's all it could be. And as a result, you can't even hear, let alone give an accounting of your abuses of power, because it's the wrong person. What do you mean? My power is only in self-defense. And when somebody else has a narrative which says, excuse me, you think you're powerless as opposed to Auschwitz, you should see my story. We can't even hear it. I did a check on Google. Which army calls themselves or uses the word defense in the name of their army? It's interesting. With the exception of North Korea, we are the only superpower on the list. Botswana. A lot of African countries, a lot of countries which don't even have enough power, they don't even have soft power. None of the Western democracies, they don't use the word defense. Power is an exercise of my sovereignty. But in our story, from our beginning, power was intimately connected to our desire to live. And so we couldn't even imagine an abuse of power. And one of the reasons why we are so frightened from a conversation of Nakba is that we can't even allow a space to consider, because it's so alien to our core existence. For Israelis, one of the classic mottos is, nobody's going to teach us ethics. We have the most moral army in the world, and we acquire those not through an empirical analysis or verification, which could be or could not be. But in fact, we acquire it through an essential understanding of where we have come from. It's the Israel Defense Forces, period. But what happens when you are a superpower with a 1947-48 consciousness? And now we're ready to go to the second part. Up till now was the introduction. Literally. And now we're ready to talk about the next essence or the next feature of our story of power. How do we understand it? It's a value, but we're aware of the fact that it's not. Because I say power is a value and I say dayenu, I'm not saying that power is the sole value or the ultimate value. Power when used to defend, power when used in the service of sovereignty and self-defense is one thing. How do we understand and how do we make sure that we use this power? This idea of power which defined who we were, how will it shape who we are going to become? What are the next chapters of this story that we tell? Because one of the essential challenges of Israel today is how do we use our power justly? Now that you are a superpower, what are your responsibilities? How do you think about it? In our tradition, now I want to delve more deeply into our tradition. There are two modalities of acquiring power. One is Genesis 1, and one is in Genesis 2. The first modality of acquiring power we read. It is power given to us as a defining feature of our humanity. We are created in the image of God. God is the God of power, because God creates, and God creates us in God's image, which means that God gives us the power to rule the world and master it. You acquire power through your DNA. You acquire power through actualizing your human potential. You know the song Adon Olam Asher Malach? Adon Olam. Who is Adon Olam? According to Genesis 1, we are Adon Olam. We are masters of the world. And to claim it and to actualize it is one way to acquire power. The second way to acquire power is in Genesis 2. The Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. Genesis 2 has a completely different understanding of power. Genesis 1 has God giving humanity power in the essence of our being. Genesis 2 has God holding on to power. God is the one who gives power, and we have access to God's power not through fulfilling or actualizing our humanity, but by obeying the word of God. You want to stay in the garden, which you didn't plant, because you're powerless. I'm the God of power. I plant the garden. I place you there. You want to stay there? There's one condition. Of every tree of the garden you shall eat, but of the tree in the middle of the garden you shall not eat, for whoever eats of it shall die. You want access to my power? Obey. In Genesis 1, the master of the universe, the powerful one, is the human being. In Genesis 2, we can acquire power, but only through accessing God's power, which God will give us through the obeying of God's commandments. Now, one of the interesting features of the Bible is that both stories of human acquiring power failed. The Garden of Eden fails because the one thing we do not want to do is God gave us the one piece of power, not hard power, but the power to say no. And we saying no seems to be inherent to the human condition. And so the first thing, Genesis 3, the one tree which we're not supposed to eat of, that's the tree we eat from. Genesis 1, the fall is in Genesis 4. Because Genesis 1 says you are to be the masters of the world. And if you look at it again, it says God created human beings as God said, be fertile, increase, fill the earth, master it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. Who are we not supposed to be masters over? Other human beings. We are supposed to be masters of the world, but we are not supposed to use our power to control others. And the first exercise of hard power in the Bible is what? Cain killing Abel. First exercise of hard power, we are masters, we kill. And that story continues throughout Genesis until we get to Genesis 6, when God finally says, the Lord saw how great was the extent of human beings' wickedness, source 5, on earth, and the Lord, how every plan devised by their mind was nothing but evil all the time. The earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness, with violence. Human beings who are masters of the world want to use their power to be masters over others. Now, the Bible attempts to correct this core narrative of power in Genesis 9. Genesis 9 offers the core directive to how you're supposed to use hard power. Because God in Genesis 1 thought, I didn't have a problem. I created you in my image. I know how to use power. You're going to know how to use power, but not. When God gave us divine power, the possibility, the desire, the inclination to abuse it was inherent within the human condition. And therefore God says, I have to offer a new commandment. I do not merely have to give you power, I have to give you instructions on how to use it. And in Genesis 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, mirroring and copying Genesis 1, be fertile and increase and fill the earth. The fear and the dread of you shall be upon all the beasts of the earth and upon all the birds of the sky, everything which the earth is astir, and upon all the fish of the sea that were given into your hands. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat, as with the green grass. You must not, however, eat. Oh, they took out the wrong part. Ugh. 5 and 6 are the verses you need. I have power. Limited, it seems. God says, you shall not eat flesh with the blood. But even more so, you shall not shed the blood of another human being. For whoever sheds the blood of another human being, I will demand their blood from them. Why? For in the image of God did God make them. What are these two verses that you don't have? Which those are the verses hopefully you'll remember. Genesis 9 is doing a midrash on Genesis 1. Genesis 1 says to be created in the image of God is to have God's power. Genesis 9 is now saying to be created in the image of God is to understand that all human beings have value and all human life is equal. I am going to give you that power to rule the world, but now you need a commandment to guide you. And that commandment is that wherever you go, your fellow human beings are your equals. They claim you. And whoever sheds the blood of another human being, their life is forfeit for all of humanity are created in the image of God. And as the rabbinic tradition teaches, no human being could ever say, my father is greater than your father, or my mother is greater than your mother. The story of the creation of humanity creates the fundamental recognition of the equality of all human beings, regardless of your religious, national, racial, or gender identities. Now listen to this very, very carefully. Zionism is about embracing the power of Genesis 1. Judaism embraced Genesis 2. And in a very deep way, Zionism and Judaism were at odds. This is the essential feature of the secular revolt of Zionism against Judaism. Because Judaism said the way we acquire power is through loyalty to God, and we're going to wait until God will come back. We are going to change our destiny through Torah and kashrut, not through muscles. Zionism said, not merely give me back my body, give me back my humanity. Zionism are Genesis 1 Jews. But the story of the Jewish people starting in Genesis 12, go forth from your father's land, from your homeland, to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. You want to be a great nation? There's just one condition. It's the same thing as the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, you want the garden, you have to eat, you can't eat of the tree. You want access to my blessing? Obey. And the whole Bible, the whole story of God's relationship with the Jewish people repeats the Garden of Eden story in different forms, in which reward and punishment are attached to commandments, and they are the way in which we access God's power.
Say that, please repeat that.
I can't. It just came out so profound, I just want to enjoy it for a moment. The only way you access God's power is through obeying God's commandment. It came out better before, but that's the idea. Reward and punishment are the way in which you experience God's power, and they are determined. The reward and punishment are connected to the commandments. You obey, you live. You disobey, you die. That is the essence of the whole Bible if you want to stand on one foot. When the Jewish people listen, they are rewarded. When they do not listen, they are punished, because all power is in the hands of God. And Zionism says, give me my humanity. How do I correct the abuse of Genesis 1? To know that to be created in the image of God is not just to have access to power, but to recognize that all human beings are equal in value. How do I protect against the abuses of Genesis 2 power? There are no abuses. Why? Because God has the power. God's not going to use it unjustly. God's going to determine who gets and who doesn't get. But the problem with Genesis 2 is that when it comes to the Jewish story, it gets associated with chosenness. Next big idea. Genesis 12 says, Lech lecha, and I will make of you a great nation. The challenge of chosenness is that it, in theory, could override Genesis 9. And I know I'm giving you all a headache, but just remember, all you have to know, Genesis 1, Genesis 2 are a code. Genesis 3, Genesis 4, Genesis 6. Genesis 1, Genesis 2 are two modalities of power. Genesis 3, Genesis 4, Genesis 6 are the story of the fall from power. Two different stories. Genesis 9 is an attempt to correct the fall from Genesis 1. Genesis 12 is where Genesis 2 becomes the Jewish story. Got it? Good. In theory, there are no abuses of power if God is the God of power. But chosenness actually created an essential challenge, which is one of the most difficult challenges facing Israel today. What happens when you combine the two modalities of power in the same instance? What happens when the chosen people want to be Genesis 1 Jews? What happens when Genesis 12 Jews, chosenness, want to be Genesis 1 Jews? And what you get is Deuteronomy 20. Please turn. I'm a little upset now. One second. Can I just be upset for a minute? I got over it. Google. I have power. I have immense power. I just have to spell Deuteronomy. That's a challenge. I know, I first had to spell Deuteronomy. It was like my problem was D-E-U-T. It was not D-U-E, it was D-U-E-T. Okay. When we're going to do, in the eclectic spirit of today, King James. King James has more hits than Safaria, so it's the one that came on. When you go to battle against your enemies, and you see horses and chariots and people greater than thee, more numerous than thee, do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Perfect. When you go to battle against your enemies, don't worry. You're a Genesis 2 through a Genesis 12 Jew. You're chosen. God has the power. Don't worry. You're going to go to your enemy. God is going to be with you. God is going to fight for you. Wonderful. You would think that Deuteronomy 20 is a story of Genesis 2 through 12, through the 12 lens. But the Bible continues and tells us, you know, these wars, these enemies, when you go to them and you besiege these enemies of yours, and you make war against them, first proclaim peace. Beautiful. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace, then all the people there shall be slaves to you and serve you. If they don't think that that's a great idea, and instead choose power, then fight them and kill all the men. The men, women, the little ones, cattle, all the rest you can keep for yourselves, because these are the spoil of your enemies which the Lord your God has given to you. Now, who are we talking about here? Thus you shall do unto all the cities that are very far away from you. Not cities that are far, but cities that are very far away from you. Which means these are wars of aggression. When we said here enemy, these were not wars of self-defense. These were wars against nations that lie very far from you. You see here what happens when Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 gets combined in the same war. When I want to exercise my power, I ignore. Normally, I'm supposed to be limited by Genesis 9. But if I'm God's chosen one, I could circumscribe. I could bypass Genesis 9. I could bypass the notion that all human beings are created in the image of God, because God is fighting with me. Chosenness dramatically changes the core instructions on how you use war. Soft power in the Bible is the way we treat the stranger in our midst. In soft power, We build our society and recognize that all human beings are created in the image of God, and therefore the stranger shall be to you as one of your citizens. In biblical morality of war, however, most of the wars are Genesis 2 wars. They're wars which God decides, fight here, fight there, don't fight here. Genesis 20, though, tells us, Deuteronomy 20 tells us what happens when the two get combined. When a nation wants to exercise its power, and basically through the prism of chosenness, we repeat the fall over and over again. A concluding thought. What is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That is the whole Torah. The essential question is, who is the other? Genesis 9 says to you, the other is every single human being, and therefore you will always be tempted. It will always be an idea. It will always be an aspiration. And I know that power to be a player is going to be inherently connected to danger. It's going to be part of your story. But we know what it means to get it right. To fail is not a problem. It's to idealize your failure is when we have a problem. The fact that you're going to abuse power, human beings are going to get it wrong. The Bible tells us that's essential to who we are, but this is who you ought to be. This is the journey. The story of Jewish power is to become fully human being, become a full human being, and recognize that you inhabit the world with other full human beings. And that all your power is only to enable you to be sovereign. It's not to enable you to rule over other human beings. The challenge is that chosenness could change the way you understand Hillel. What is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. Others are fellow chosen human beings. Because the real word in Aramaic is not others. It's the alayich snei lechevrach lo ta'avid. The word in Aramaic, chevrach, what does it sound like to you? Chaver, friend. Who is your friend? Who claims you? Is it Leviticus 19, the stranger who claims you? Or is it fellow chosen? You're sitting here in Israel. I want to go to North America for one moment. Jews of North America do not have hard power. Most minorities don't have hard power. You have access to hard power through the power of the United States or Canada. But as a Jew, you do not have access directly yourself to power. The remarkable success of North American Jewish life is our ability to marshal soft power to help and protect us. And in fact, the soft power of North America very often dwarfs the hard power of Israeli Jews. But what is the Torah of North American Judaism? One of the essential features of the Torah of North American Judaism is that what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. Others are fellow Genesis 9 human beings. If you go across 90% of American Jew and Canadian Jewish life, you live and care and are concerned for the Jewish people, and you understand that all human beings are created in the image of God, and as a result, you remove the negative implications of chosenness and speak about chosenness not as a statement of God's unique love for the Jewish people, but you speak about chosenness as a unique responsibility bestowed upon us. This shift, it happens in 18th century, in 19th century European Judaism as well, but they disappear. Today, the pillar of Judaism that North American Jewish life stands on is the idea that what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others, has to be guided, not by Deuteronomy 20, but by Genesis 9. That's what it means to be a liberal North American Jew, whether you're Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Post-denominational, or secular. Any of the above. That is also the deep meaning of Tikkun Olam. What is the deep meaning as Jews began to be more successful, more at home? Tzedakah, which only referred to helping fellow Jews, gets translated and put into a larger category of Tikkun Olam. The world claims me because I am part of that world. I am a Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They integrate into a complex identity. I am a Jew, but I never forget my Genesis 9 roots. That is the major innovation of North American Jewish life. It guides your politics. It guides your social activism. It guides your volunteerism. It guides, Jews have enough to take care of themselves, but they don't. They are concerned for the welfare of their society because every human being is created in the image of God. Israel gives us the gift of heart power. I love having access to heart power. I love being able to be a player in the world and trying, even if I fail, playing and trying to determine my life, the dignity that it gives. The fullness of my humanity is brought to bear in the midst of my sovereignty. But the challenge of Israel is to use its hard power with the same level of sensitivity that North American Jews use their soft power. Because we can, in Israel, we have to decide, who are we? Are we a sovereign state in which we are reclaiming Genesis 1? Then Genesis 9 applies to you. But if you feel the miraculous, if this is the state where God is unfolding the future of the Messianic era, then when we use Genesis 1 power, are we merely soldiers in God's army? Then we remove the core corrective possibility of Genesis 9. State and religion in Israel is not a question over whether there's a bus which could ride in Tel Aviv, or whether in Rishon LeZion a store could be opened. The essential challenge of state and religion is for us to decide, who are we? You want to be a sovereign state, then claim Genesis 1 with all of its limitations. But if you want to be a religious state with superpower status, then power, instead of being the fulfillment and expression of all that is human, will become the foundation of our fall over and over again. And please remember, in our tradition, unlike in Christianity, the fall is not the result of our physical temptation of the tree. The fall is the result of our abuse of the gift of our humanity. Whether Israel will tell a new story or be a fall after a fall after a fall is the challenge that we face in the 21st century. But it is a challenge that I embrace, because just as I choose power, even if it doesn't keep my children safe, I choose power knowing that I can abuse it. But that's the fight that I want to fight. I don't want to go back to being a moral, noble human being who is powerless. The gift of Israel and the responsibility of Israel is, how do we tell the story of power and make it noble? How do we tell the story of power and make it redemptive? Thank you. We have 15 minutes for questions. To do what is just and right is not easy. Power is tempting. But here we could go back both to Genesis and to the North American experience. Jews embrace others as a part of what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. Because this is something that I've spoken about, we've all spoken about ad nauseum, because you have complex identities. Because in America, you're not just connected to your Jewishness, you're connected to your humanness as part of your identity. And as I've said it from this stage thousands of times, there is no intermarriage in North America. Intermarriage does not exist in North American Jewish life. Some of you are looking surprised. It doesn't exist because intermarriage is a marriage between somebody with one identity, which is singular, and someone with another identity, which is singular. When Jew, singular identity, marries Christian, singular identity, you have intermarriage. There is no such marriage in America. You have Jew, liberal, conservative, male, female, multiple other genders, economic status, human being marrying Christian, liberal, conservative, male, female, other genders, social class, American. And in fact, when you're marrying, it's not the Jew and the Christian who are marrying, it's the American and the American, or the Canadian and the Canadian, or more importantly, the human being and another human being falling in love and then asking, okay, we have part of our identities conflict, we'll have to deal with that. And there are multiple ways of dealing with it. But that's the decision, and that's why Jews who intermarry, just like Christians who aren't leaving their Jewishness or leaving their Christianity, because it's my other identities. So how do we do that? And this is going to be something that Masua is going to speak about more tomorrow. When we have complex identities, then we expand the parameters of who is our other. Who is our other? Chosenness makes your other only a Jew. Genesis 1 says, through Genesis 9, you're not just a Jew. Before you're a Jew of Genesis 12, you're a human being. Claim both of those, activate them, then the chances of limiting your other are limited, the chances of you limiting it are greater. In Israel, in North America, you live day to day the complex identity of Jewishness. And it creates challenges, but it expands the parameters of your moral horizons. In Israel, we returned as Genesis 1 Jews, but are telling a Genesis 2 through Genesis 12 story. And our identities are very singular. And how many Israelis will tell you, yeah, there's Israelis and Arabs. You ever hear the saying Israelis and Arabs? What's the problem? There's Israeli Arabs. But it took me years to just, the Israeli, are they the Israelis? Is Israeliness, chosenness, Genesis 12 makes Israeliness Jewish. The more we can have complex identities, that's what Genesis 9 is telling you. Remember, Genesis 9 doesn't exist before Judaism. It's the first parts of Judaism. It tells you that before you become a Jew, there's a human being who claims you. The more you could engage in that, and this is what this whole seminar, listen, I'm a teacher. There are multiple ways in which a person grows, experiences, life, and the stories we tell. This story that I'm telling is an attempt to expand What is the nature of the identities that we have? What do we think about? Because when we were in the diaspora, I wasn't as worried 2,000 years ago, because we couldn't hurt anybody. But now, we really are the masters of our universe. And now, we need to tell a different story. And so, this is an attempt to effectuate the end that I yearn for. Do you feel that I responded? Thank you very much.
You know, you have many secular Jews in Israel that do not accept Genesis 1 notion. And then you have...
Who?
Secular Israelis.
Who? Secular Israelis?
Yes.
They don't accept Genesis 1?
Well, the Genesis 1 notion that we were in the image of God.
You see, okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'll explain then. In a moment, I'll explain to you the Hartman Institute on one foot in one moment.
Okay, yeah, so my...
Because it's a very, very good observation. Could I answer that?
Please, but the other coin is, which I think is part of the conflict, and if you could address it, I would appreciate it, is the very orthodox, I would say maybe far right, that see it as a divine right, that we have the right for everything because of that. How do you reconcile both?
Actually, the only ones in Israel who don't accept Genesis 1 are small segments of the ultra-Orthodox community. They're the only ones who don't accept Genesis 1. And even they have become Zionists. They just don't want to be in a Genesis 1 army as long as we have a Genesis 1 army. So they like Jewish hard power as long as it protects them, because they can't be in that without becoming secular. But when we talk about Genesis 1, secular Israelis might not, first of all, most secular Israelis believe in God. A. 2, yes, secular believes in God. But when we use Genesis 1, it's as a meta story in which this idea of being a human being is to acquire power. While Berdichevsky might not quote Genesis 1, he is a Genesis 1 Jew. So we're talking about categories that the Zionist revolution is a profoundly Jewish one. Early Zionism thought that they had to revolt against Judaism in order to be, but in fact they don't. And a big part of the Hartman Institute is to show the complexity of the story. And in fact, most secular Zionists, while initially thinking they had to leave the Jewish story, are now discovering that they don't have to. It's a more complex. Now, what they don't accept is Genesis 2 power. I don't want to live in a Genesis 2 universe. I do want to live in a Genesis 1, even if I don't, just to paraphrase it, Shulamit Aloni, the former minister of education, is being attacked at the Knesset. Viciously attacked, and she gets up shaking, and she says to everybody, "Is this the way you treat somebody who came out of Egypt with you?" And then she says, "Even though it never happened." That is secular Judaism. You understand? It's like, this is my story. They're Genesis 1 Jews completely. It's an idea, not the God and the image.
I think that we're living in an era now where the nature of power has changed, especially within Israeli society. And I guess my question here, it's sort of almost like a thought experiment, is whether or not the definition of winning has changed, and whether or not winning necessarily requires or presupposes victory, and whether it's possible to lose through abuse of power and lack of victory.
Thank you. Absolutely, you're absolutely. What it constitutes to win, and I would maybe, if I was in the 1930s or 40s, it would just be enough. You know the song Dayenu, at different stages in your life, it's enough. Just that we could be free would be enough. It's true, part of what's grown and changed, and I think this is part of what our tradition wants of us, is they want us to expand the notion of what it means to be a human being, which is not just to exercise the power, but to exercise that power justly. And so we could, go back to Joe, we could in theory win certain wars and lose far more if we would, there's this fantasy in Israel, let's go into Sheba Hospital in Gaza. Because in the underground Sheba Hospital is where all of the Hamas leaders reside. But just to get to Sheba, there's going to be 5,000 Israeli soldiers dead, or 50,000 Gazans dead, because we're going to massively bomb. We could get there, but is that a victory? How do you win an asymmetrical war? But even more than that, what Genesis 9 tells you, Cain thought he won. Genesis 9 tells you that the use of power as an expression of humanity demands also that you use that power justly. And that's the dance between Genesis 1 and Genesis 9. And when you don't do that, you think you won, but you haven't really won. And part of, I think, the conversation between Israel and North American Jews today is, are we winning? Too many Israelis think the status quo is winning. The question is whether there's a Torah that you have to not just come to Jerusalem to learn, but where there's a Torah that you have to come to Jerusalem to teach. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.